Hey everybody, this is Ryan, and I am here with a new series. This is going to be called Ryan Talks Draft. This is going to be more of an informal sort of podcast type of series where I'm just going to talk about various topics in the Pokemon draft community. I want these videos to be sort of informal and relatively relaxed, and I don't really care if a ton of people watch them, but I have a few more of these kind of lined up and already made. This will be a fairly infrequent series, especially as life gets busy, but I thought it'd be fun to at least get started on it. So, episode 1 is a topic that I know is going to be on a lot of people's minds, especially with Scarlet and Violet just having released, which is making a tier list. So, I wanted to make a quick little informal video on how to make a tier list, the kind of considerations you will have while doing it. So, going into some disclaimers and just kind of the ethos of this. Again, these are lighthearted video. I encourage discussion in the comments, and I would love some feedback on the series. I'm not going to go particularly crazy with visuals here, so if you want to just kind of listen to this, I don't mind. However, I do have slides here for bullet points if you want to just kind of read ahead. The topics and opinions I'll be sharing are very much colored by my own experience, which is biased from the leagues I've played in and the players I've competed against. I may make mistakes in this video. In fact, it's very likely I will. I will gladly take corrections, and I'm not perfect. And also, no tier list will be perfect. And I am doing this video with the ethos that you cannot make a perfect tier list for competitive draft league Pokemon. The I have a lot of experience with making tier lists before I move on. I've been an admin in quite a few leagues. I've made tier lists for singles and doubles and a variety of different styles, and I have quite a bit of experience in this field, and I've made some pretty good tier lists, if I would say so myself, here and there. So I think that I do have more than enough qualifications to at least make a sort of introductory video to the concepts that I'm going to talk about here. So getting started / your expectation, tier lists take a lot of work. I know that a lot of folks want to make the tier list for Scarlet and Violet. Putting in the time for your tier list is essential to making a great tier list. If you just sort of slap a bunch of Mons on a list, it will be really bad. Your tier list will have things mistiered. That is just a fact. You will have things that are in the wrong place. This is especially true in untested or early formats like the Scarlet and Violet format. The main thing is that you really shouldn't beat yourself up on these. Everybody makes mistakes, especially in tiering, but it is important that you learn from your mistakes and for subsequent tier lists. Don't mistier a bunch of stuff and then be too afraid to move it or be stubborn about it being correct in the first place, even though you know it wasn't. Just be open to the idea of moving things. You should always try to construct tier lists with multiple people if possible. Multiple sets of eyes on a draft tend to make the final product much better, and that is why you should probably have multiple people doing it. My primary goal in having a balanced tier list that makes it as fair as you can make it reasonably for all players. As such, I'll be focusing on tier list construction from this viewpoint. There are some people who make tier lists without the intention of things being balanced. They want certain mons in certain places to incentivize picking them or things like that. I've never been a huge fan of that mentality. I am more so I want the tier list to be balanced from top to bottom, and that's going to be my mentality for this video. So, general formats and considerations. So there's a lot of different ways you can make a tier list. Most tier lists are split into numbered or lettered tiers. Most commonly, you'll see anywhere from 4 to 7 tiers on a tier list. Locked picks, free agent hybrid, and pure point system. We are going to talk about what those all mean and the pros and cons for each. I want to talk about gimmick tiers. Now, granted, Scarlet and Violet's not going to, I don't think, have gimmick tiers. I don't think people are going to make a terastallization tier, but gimmick tiers as a whole have existed for a long time. They are more so used in singles, but sometimes a dedicated tier or selection for things like Z moves in the past have been utilized. Be very wary of things like a Gmax tier. We saw that in early Gen 8. Things like that can really skew the power of your tier list, especially if certain mons get a mechanic that other mons don't. A Mega tier would be another good example. Because not all Megas are made equal. If someone is allowed to, from the Mega tier, get Mega Kangaskhan and you're stuck with Mega Audino, the person with Mega Kangaskhan has a significant advantage over you. The same is what's true of Gmax tier, with people getting things like Gmax Rillaboom while someone else got stuck with like Gmax Garbodor. So be really conscientious of that, and you want to be really careful with gimmick tiers. Tier 0 and or S tier is technically sometimes a gimmick tier in free agent hybrids drafts at times. That's usually where you'll see a tier 0 or an S tier as those free agent hybrids, which we'll get into. And how powerful do you want your draft to be? This is actually a super important question that I don't see enough people ask, is how powerful do you want a potential draft to be? Do you want people to be able to have a decent number of tier 1s and tier 2s? Do you want those to be fairly limited with more so the middle filling out the decks? Do you want it to be that it's pretty overall low powered and you remove the ability to take a lot of high tier options? You want to make sure that you know in advance how powerful you want your drafts to be. There are some leagues where the power level of teams can be a little bit higher than other leagues. For example, MDL is a league I play in Tier 4 a lot. MDL, by its structure, tends to have slightly stronger teams than other formats, other groups I've seen. Just because our tiering will allow you to grab a pretty substantive number of higher tier Pokemon, which is fine. But to each their own, right? So just be really conscientious of that when you're making your consideration for your format. So I want to talk about only locked picks. So this is where the number of Pokemon you're allowed to take from a tier is predetermined at the start of the draft. So this draft will say you get this many 2 tier 1s, 2 tier 2s, 2 tier 3s, and you don't have any real control or say. It's that you will have Xmon in each category. So this is the only locked picks format for making a draft. I went ahead and listed pros and cons. We'll be talking about all these different formats, and I do think there are pros and cons to each. The pro is that every team has the exact distribution of Mons in each tier, so power is as even as possible across teams. There isn't really an argument against that. Granted, if you have heavy mistierings, obviously that can swing distribution of powers, but hypothetically, if everyone has the same number of Mons from each tier, the power level is going to be consistent across them, and it allows you probably the greatest control over the power level of teams compared to any of the other types of draft formats we're talking about. It's great for wanting higher or lower powered teams across a draft. It is also great for testing tier list power levels. So if you're early format and you want to test the power level of various tiers, you will get to see every single Mon in a locked tier perform at its tier. I also think it is the most successful for newer players. They don't have any points to keep track of. There's no real huss or fuss. You just say, here are the Mons you get from each tier, and you call it a day. The cons for this is that only locked picks has the least flexibility. Being locked into a specific Mon from each tier doesn't really give players a meaningful amount of control however they want their team balanced. And over time, teams do tend to be structured pretty similarly without much deviation, which isn't that shocking, because you don't have a lot of freedom. So people will start structuring their teams in a very similar manner to each other. So that is the only locked picks format. Not necessarily my favorite, but I do think that some people should maybe consider it more often than they do, because there are definitely some benefits to it, especially early format. Next is free agent hybrid. This is probably the most common draft style that exists. This is where you do have locked picks, but you also have what are called free agents, where you have a budget and you can spend that to control some of your other picks to fill out your team. This is probably the most common draft style, and most coaches are familiar with it. It allows you for some customization of teams, but it does keep power level under control, and it will force the use of lower tiers. It's one of the things a lot of people like about this format is that realistically, you only will typically, depending on how many free agents you want, but let's just go with 4 because I think that's probably the most standard. You have 4 Pokemon you get to select yourself, but there will be, the rest of your team will be utilized as well that are your picks that you actually are locked into. You have to grab a tier 5, you have to grab this many tier 1s, this many tier 3s. So it does allow you to control that while allowing for some customization. I think free agent hybrid also does generally reward players for paying close attentions to synergies and tiering very closely, and it also rewards planning very well. If you plan your draft well in advance, you can do things like totally ignore your last tier 2 lock because everybody else has already grabbed whatever Pokemon. So you are rewarded for paying very close attention to the draft as a whole, with the free agent hybrid. It also rewards you for being aware of the synergies that you need, because then you can spend points for synergies that you need to with your free agents. I do think free agent has a couple cons though. There isn't as much expression as as it seems like at a first glance. So obviously this allows for some customization, but let's say a team has the 4 free agent slots, which I would say is the most standard, and they want to use the slot to fill out a mode on their team. Let's say that they need a weather sweeper, or they need a terrain setter, or whatever. That actually determines the budget instead of the player's necessarily playstyle choices. A lot of the time I've noticed that the free agent slots are filled via necessity for the team to function, rather than because, oh, I want to draft this thing, it seems really cool, or oh, I want my draft to be slightly top heavier and spend my free agent points towards getting 2 tier 1s and I'll take 2 tier 5s. A lot of the time it's actually determined by the modes the coaches want, rather than necessarily any kind of decision over their own power level. And also, most players will budget their free agents pretty similarly, and functionally it can feel somewhat identical to an only free pick draft. So I don't think those are necessarily major cons, but it is worth noting that while the style does give you, the coach, definite freedom to express themselves, it can be a little deceptive in that it's not always as much as coaches might think. So now I'm going to talk about pure points. So this is a system where Pokemon are split into tiers, and then Pokemon out of a tier cost points. And instead of having any kind of lock, as in you need to have X number in this tier and X number in this tier, you just spend your points and you make whatever team you want, and that's the system. Pure point system does offer the most customization option without question. You can decide how many of whichever Pokemon you want, and that's pretty much it. Budgeting being on the player rewards adaptability and planning in equal measure. Being able to quickly adapt and being able to also plan some adaptations in advance and plan multiple types of budgets does reward that sort of thing. There is a great deal of risk rewards at all stages of the drafting and team building process. Do you want to make your team very, very top heavy and get a bunch of tier 1 Pokemon and leave yourself with few resources at the bottom? Do you want to go for some of those mid-tier Pokemon, knowing that those are more likely to be sniped in this kind of a format? That risk reward is pretty constant in pure points, in a way that I haven't necessarily seen in the other 2 formats I've discussed. I do think pure points is really great for more experienced players overall. If you've got very experienced coaches, I do think pure points does work better. I think that pure points is a bit of a nightmare for newer coaches. I would not recommend this if you are running a league that has newer coaches that haven't done draft before as a majority of your base. You definitely don't want to do this. There are some cons, though, to the pure point system. It's very volatile, and that's really the only way to put it. Pure points, because there isn't that structure, it feels very volatile, and that constant risk reward that everybody is doing can make the draft board feel a little crazy. This system also can make it harder to adapt to snipes and make it harder to make draft plans on the whole, because without the security of guaranteed mons from certain tiers, things can spiral quickly. If you make, let's say, a loose plan and you need X number of Pokemon from either tier 2 or tier 3, and it just so happens that everybody is spending their picks in that area, you're completely out of luck. And it's because budgeting is so specific, if your budget gets thrown out the window, because of snipes, it becomes very, very difficult to make a new plan. It can require alterations to your transaction rules as well, depending on how easy you want it to be to alter team composition. Pure points tends to have the most complicated transaction rules via necessity, because Pokemon are worth points instead of being in a tier. So normally transaction rules are pretty simple. You can trade a Pokemon from within a tier with another Pokemon in a tier. And while that can be true for these kind of point systems, you do have to consider how many trades can they make, how many different things can they alter in their budget. It can get kind of complicated, so the transaction rules do get more complex. Some players also tend to take issue with very top-heavy comps. I've seen this a few times where it'll be a pure point system, and they'll have a team of 11 Mons, and a person will draft only tier 1 and tier 2, and then grab a bunch of nothing Pokemon at the bottom of their draft. Some players feel like this goes against the sort of philosophy of draft, in that they think that draft is about being able to use Pokemon that don't see a lot of usage, and they think that the idea that people can just have very top-heavy comps that look like a standard ladder VGC team is not healthy. I don't really have any particular issue with this, but I do want to be aware that it can be an issue, that some players will take issue with that in of itself, and that's I think not an unfair philosophy to have. I also think the peer point system is just really unwieldy to new players. Just overall, like if you have a lot of new coaches, do not do a peer point system. I think that it can make things really hard because they don't really have a concept as to how draft teams should look, how the balance should look, because of that inexperience, and they will probably grossly overpay and underpay for various things. So lastly is Open Draft. Open Draft is actually what a lot of leagues are going to be doing early on. This is where there are no tiers, and you just get to pick Pokemon off a board. And that's it. That's pretty much the only rule. Usually a few Pokemon will be banned, box legends, things like that. Generally the pros, Open Draft is great for testing out brand new formats. That's pretty much the main pro. Open Draft lets you test a bunch of Pokemon in order to be able to tier them in the future. It is absolutely chaotic. If you are into chaos, you will like Open Draft. It is the easiest draft style to set up. If you need to make a tier list quickly, well, there is no tier list. You just write down on the names of all the Mons on a list, and then you highlight them off, and then bada boom, you're good. It does have some consequences, though. Open Draft is the most unbalanced option for a draft. Its teams will vary wildly in power, and the season won't be balanced. I know that Sandbox is currently planning to do an Open Draft. I'm actually one of the people that's responsible for that. We are doing a 6-week season in part because we know that the teams aren't going to be balanced. It should really only be done for casual leagues and or for very early seasons into a new generation to allow you to make better tier lists in the future, where this gives you an opportunity to observe the Mons and just sort of see how they perform and what they do in draft. So now I'm going to talk about the number of tiers that you actually opt to have in a thing. So I'm going to start with a lower number of tiers. So we're going to say that that's around 4 to 5 tiers. So pros, having less tiers makes it easier to have greater type diversity and role fulfillment across a tier list. So by having less tiers, there will be more Pokemon of various types within tiers. This is especially good for locked pick or the free agent hybrid, where you want to make sure that people can have nice type diversity and role fulfillment. The power level in tiers is much wider, but the average power does tend to even out, making the lower number of tier lists less likely to have over or under tiered Mons. And it makes it so that those Mons that are over or under tiered are less consequential. So if you have a lot more tiers, the power level's very tight. If you have a lot of Pokemon in a tier, the average level does tends to balance out. So even if there are some really low value Pokemon in a given tier or some very high value Pokemon, the average power level will overall be more consistent just because you have more things that are averaging out. I do advise a lower number of tiers for experimental or new formats, as it is more likely to result in a balanced season. Early on, it is very difficult to split Mons into things like 7 tiers, because you just don't have enough information. Doing a lower number of tiers for newer formats is generally going to be preferred because you are less likely to mistier things, and when you do mistier things, it may be overall less consequential. There are some cons, though. The wider power gap does make some tiering decisions harder, and it makes power a little more ambiguous. This usually, I notice, will happen in a 5-tier tier list with tier 4 or tier 3, where there are Pokemon where it's like, okay, is this a tier 3? Is this a tier 4? Is this a tier 3? Is this a tier 2? Where deciding where that cutoff line is for the tiers gets harder because there's so many more Mons in them. And because of that, there tends to be a lot more Pokemon on the border between tiers when you have less tiers. And at the same time, there are also Mons at either end of the power level that will make some Mons basically required to grab, while other Mons will be totally unviable. So because there are so many Pokemon, the top end and lower end of that power level means that while there are some cool Mons that might see play, if they were down a tier, they might be too strong for that tier, so now they're just unviable. You can't grab that Mon in a given tier. And then some of the high-end Mons, it's like, well, I have to grab this in tier 3. It's like there are 40 Mons in tier 3, and this is one of the top 5, clearly. So I have to grab it. So that kind of can be the major issue with a lower number of tiers, is that the power tends to be a lot harder to deal with and handle. Then higher number of tiers, pretty much all Mons can be drafted viably on a tier list where you have more tiers, 6 to 7 tiers or so. And because the power level is very clearly defined, so for people, if you're someone who really cares about every Mon should be able to be drafted, if you're someone with that philosophy, you're going to want to have a higher number of tiers. And a great deal of freedom is allowed by having more tiers, and it's really good if the metagame is well understood and well defined. I don't recommend making a tier list with a lot of tiers early on, but after a metagame has settled and you've played a lot of drafts with it, and you want to start considering adding more tiers, I think that's not always a bad idea. It's really good for those kind of metagames. When it's done really well, I do think that a high number of tiers list does result in the most balanced and overall fair list. I do have some problems with it, though. So, high number tier list tends to be used with pure points, and this is a result of, and it can be used with the other two formats, but most people will tend towards pure points. The main reason is because since there are less Mons in a tier, without the pure point system, you're really going to struggle to allow for full type cores. If you are requiring everyone to grab a Mon from tier 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, and someone wants to make a Fire, Water, Grass core, and tier 2 has one fire type, that can make things really problematic. So you almost have to, you don't necessarily have to do pure points, but you are going to need to have a way to make sure that people can fill cores and different modes without being overly punished, which is really difficult to do without pure points. It requires a really in-depth knowledge of viability of each Mon in a format, as a mis-tiered Mon will perform better. Because tier list power is much more concentrated and you understand the power, if something is supposed to be a tier 1 but you put it in tier 2, that means that that Mon is going to well overperform what it should, compared to another list where, compared to less, one of our less numbered tier lists, just by the nature of it. And it's much harder and requires a lot more knowledge on the whole. High number tier lists are really, really hard to make, and it should really only be done by people who are experienced at making tier lists and have made probably a tier list or two for the given format they're working within. I don't think these are ever bad. In fact, I know a lot of people are coming around on them being quite good. It's just that whenever you do them, I think there are a lot of considerations compared to the standard 4 to 5 tier. So you just have to have all those considerations in mind while making them. Comparative tier power. So one of the biggest flaws I see in tier lists from groups that don't have great tier lists is that the power within a tier is highly inconsistent. This results in Mons being effectively under or over tiered to the point of being a must grab or must avoid. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Marowak and Diggersby, with a Marowak in tier 2 and a Diggersby in tier 3. So Diggersby has the ability Huge Power, and Marowak has Thick Club. Diggersby can hit Landorus T levels of power, and we're going to go ahead and just stick with Dynamax format because that's what most people watching this video are familiar with. Both are excellent max options, however Diggersby gets an additional stab, and because it gets that additional stab, and is really good for that. Now, Marowak does have the niche of Lightning Rod and being a little bit better in Trick Room than Diggersby, but overall the actual output from these two Mons is very similar. And Diggersby has better coverage as well. You can actually argue that the two have around the same level of viability, if not giving the edge to Diggersby outright for having dual stab and overall better coverage. And because of this, if you put Marowak in tier 2 and Diggersby in tier 3, should always grab Diggersby. Marowak becomes like a non-factor on your tier list because Diggersby is so strong for tier 3. It just absolutely knocks the rest of the tier out of the water. So you have to grab Diggersby. And that is the inconsistency of power. And that is where it is so blatant that, and even when you compare it to Mons that are similar, you may disagree with me and say, well, Marowak is better than Diggersby. That's totally fine. But even if you are of the opinion that Marowak is better than Diggersby, they have enough power that they should be in the same tier. And that is the problem with undertiering Mons, even just based on, well, these are both offensive ground types. And even if you think Marowak is better than Diggersby, they're so neck and neck in terms of just output that they should either be tiered together, or frankly, you should probably have Diggersby above Marowak. So that is sort of how that works. And then what you have to do is that you have to look through your tier list very carefully to ensure that power is consistent across the tiers. Base attacking stats are important if you are looking at it, and abilities as well, like huge power, or items like Fit Club, which we'll get into. And so if you're looking at your tier list and you're noticing that you're going through tier 3 and you have a Pokemon with, like, let's say an insane number, 160 attack and 100 speed. And now, granted, obviously, you might have something like Rampardos, where it has an extremely high attack stat, but it's pretty unviable because it's got low speed and low defenses. But let's say that you're going through your list and you find something with just incredibly good offensive stats compared to everything else around it, with a good ability and a good speed stat. You should probably bump that thing a tier. I know that seems obvious to a lot of people listening, but it is consistently the problem I see the most often on tier lists from tier lists that aren't as strong, is that they're not paying very mindful attention to how powerful Pokemon are within a given tier. The other thing is that support Pokemon should also be considered when comparing power, and you should make support pieces of comparable viability within the same tiers. Newer tier list makers will usually undervalue support Pokemon. A lot of the time you'll see support Pokemon, prankster Pokemon, tier list Trick Room setters, things that are just really fast and annoying. You'll see them like severely under-tiered for where they're at. You want to make sure that your support Pokemon are being as considered, or if not honestly more considered, than some of the offensive Pokemon, because they can easily make and break tier lists because of the synergy they supply to top tier Mons. And you want to make sure that the support pieces within a tier are comparable viability. So you want to make sure that you're not having something like Whimsicott in tier 2, because Whimsicott is going to be a better support Pokemon than all the other support Pokemon in tier 2 more than likely, and it should probably be tier 1 with something like a Grimmsnarl. So that is just that's an off-the-cuff example, but that's sort of the idea. So I want to talk about roles, which is pay attention to the roles and niches of Mon within various tiers, and what resources are available in various tiers. This is especially true for redirection and prankster Mons. There aren't a lot of Pokemon that get good redirection, particularly follow me redirection, and there aren't a ton of really excellent prankster Mons, so you want to make sure that you're being very careful about what resources you want in each tier, and making sure that those are tiered appropriately. The number of times I have seen Togetic severely under-tiered because people don't forget it has Eviolite Follow Me is insane. So be very careful about your scarcity of roles within, and especially for roles that are harder. You want to make sure that roles have a wider distribution and are available across the tier list based on viability. You'll want Mons with roles that are harder to come by tiered higher, so players have a consequence for getting something with a useful niche other Mons don't get. So if something is one of the very few follow me users in the format, sure, it might not have as many good tools as maybe some of the outside of that. It maybe is on par with a tier 3 support Mon, but because it has that thing that so few Pokemon get, you want to make a consequence for grabbing it. You want someone to have to pay a little extra for whatever that thing is. So you need to keep it in a higher tier so that there is a risk reward for grabbing it. Typing distribution. This is something I care a lot about. Not everybody who makes tier lists cares about it as much as I do, but I tend to be pretty persnickety on it. In theory, your tier list should allow you to have Pokemon cores be built from Pokemon of all tiers. So all your standard Fire, Water, Grass, your Fairy, Dragon, Steel, all that stuff, you should be able to build cores from Pokemon within all the different tiers. In practice, this is super difficult, particularly regarding fairy types, but you want to make sure that there are types that are distributed throughout the tier list as evenly as you can manage while keeping balance. Having every single fairy type in tier 1 and tier 2 is a bad idea, as it will overly incentivize grabbing those mons to fulfill type cores, rather than and it will make other mons in that tier more undraftable because you have to grab your fairy type from X tier or your steel type from X tier. It's not really something you want to like split hairs over, but it is really easy with strong defensive or offensive typings to accidentally end up in this situation. Be mindful of this and you should be fine. Generally, if you have something that is a borderline mon and you go, hey, I can't make a Fire, Water, Grass core with a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 mon. And let's say that mon's a fire type, maybe you put it in tier 3 just for the typing distribution to allow players to actually be able to grab things from each tier in order to have a nice even distribution. Synergy opportunity cost is a really big deal. So there are a really good deal of Pokemon that synergize particularly well with another Pokemon, so keeping the cost of these modes in mind is highly important. Mons like Weezing, Drifblim, Terrain, and Weather Setters are pretty much the main examples. So these Mons offer pretty insane synergies. While on their own they're not particularly useful, or even without their synergy they're not particularly useful, with certain partners these things become very strong. So you have to keep in mind that you need to keep a cost for high synergy things. In a vacuum, Weezing shouldn't be tiered particularly high. But when you consider mons like Slacking or Regigigas, well, now Weezing needs to cost something, because if it doesn't cost something, then that combination of Pokemon that's so strong is now easily attainable. The same is true of Terrain and Weather Setters. So I want to talk about Pelipper. So in MDL, we had a season where we decided that we wanted to drop Pelipper to tier 3, from tier 2 to tier 3, because we weren't really feeling like it was going to be as viable. We felt like a lot of the Rainmons weren't as strong, we weren't as worried about it, and the problem is that then made Ludicolo Pelipper a tier 3 combo, and that was way too strong for tier 3. That was a combo that performed at a level far above what it should have. If Pelipper had been in tier 2, it would have been fine. But because we made that synergy opportunity cost very low, it resulted in a unbalanced in that person's team. And that team ended up winning the season. So the following season, we of course corrected our mistake and Pelipper bumped up a tier again. But that concept of synergy opportunity cost can bite even people who are really experienced in the butt. So you have to be super, super careful, especially with those Terrain and Weather Setters, on where you want to put them, because the actual synergy or opportunity cost of a mode is really important. We're going to see this a lot in Scarlet and Violet with Dondozo. I'm not going to go into any particular depth, but knowing how much you want that mon to cost with its partner is going to be a massive deal. You do not want to make that combo cheap, but you also don't want to make it so expensive that it's completely unviable to draft. So you'll have to make a bit of a judgment call on your tier list on that. But I wanted to bring up that one in particular because I know that's going to be the new hot thing that people are going to talk about on tier lists. Combos that aren't seen on ladder can also be highly viable in draft and need to be accounted for. It's really hard, especially when you are early in a format, to find combos that haven't been seen on the ladder, but in a draft setting, some of those combos can be very, very good. A good example of that would be in Gen 8, Drifblim, Rillaboom didn't get a ton of play, but it's an extremely good synergy in draft because of how well Drifblim can pair with things and how difficult it is to stop because Drifblim is a ghost type and can't be faked out, which for draft was a huge deal. So there are certain combos that are highly viable in a draft that won't be viable in ladder, and you need to account for these and be really careful about them. To learn about these types of synergies, I'd highly recommend watching games from top players and doing your own research. Research the Mons extensively, find games from people that try to watch as many games as you can to find people that are using combinations you hadn't thought of, and then try to make sure that your synergy opportunity cost is appropriate. This might be the most important slide. Do your research. My God. The number of times I've talked with people and they have a tier list that isn't good, and then the reason it's not good is because they forgot about items, abilities, or important moves is just staggering. It's insane. This is part of the reason why you want a team of people working on a tier list rather than doing one yourself, but you should also be checking movesets on Cerebi and looking for unique items on Showdown for every single mon. You want to do your research hard for your tier list. You don't want anything catching you off guard. If a mon has a good move or something that you don't catch, or it has an ability that you didn't read about and now it's tearing through your league, that's really on you. And that's because you didn't do your research. So put the time in and do your research. I've literally seen leagues where they'll put Marowak in the lowest absolute tier because they don't know that it gets Thick Club that doubles its attack, which is crazy to me. Like, they just aren't aware of the item. So you just have to be really, really careful because you can end up with very, very gross mistierings as a result of not doing research, and it is probably the biggest reason I see major mistakes on tier lists. You also should see how well a mon does in standard play to find out if it has any gimmicks or anything you've missed. So not only on the last slide did I talk about synergies, but even in standard play, see if, like, you know, Cybertron has a video where he uses some Pokemon with a gimmick and see how viable it is, or you run into somebody on Showdown ladder and you go, oh wow, that's a cool gimmick. Like, make sure that you check standard play as well in your research to see if you missed anything. This is also another important one. I'd highly advise you look at other leagues. At this point, the draft league community is pretty well established, actually, and it's pretty large, and most league owners won't mind if you ask them for advice, and will look at, and if you ask them if, hey, can I look at your tier list for your season or your data from the season, most league owners will actually happily let you do that. In fact, I can tell you that most of the leagues I'm affiliated with will let you do that as well. This will give you a general sense of consensus, and it will especially be helpful if you're doing a similar format. So it gives you a good sense of, hey, here's what people are saying about this. Now, while tier lists from other leagues can be really poor, which is the main reason this video exists, it is useful to have something to go off of, and there are a lot of leagues that make really good tier lists that are going to be very useful for you to use as a template to then make your own. The best data you will get, period, will come from player videos and opinions on Mons and things like season recap videos. Part of the reason I try to make season recap videos after I finish a season is so that I have a record and footnote of how I felt about using a mon when I was using it, for tiering purposes. And I know a lot of people in their videos will talk about how well they felt like mons did, whether they felt they were in the right tier, that sort of thing. And watching videos of people playing with their mons and listening to them talk about them and things like that, it is very, very valuable, and you can get a lot of really excellent data from stuff like that. I want to talk about the one season bias / the one player bias. That said, you really shouldn't let one season or one player doing exceptionally well with a mon cause you to overtier it for the following season. I see this happen a lot, where a mon will absolutely outperform everything expected of it, and the tiering committee will have to make a decision on if the mon was in the incorrect tier or if it overperformed. You'll need to evaluate whether if it was a tiering issue or if the player had a specific comp or level of skill that made that mon seem exceptionally strong. Usually, if you reach out to the player, they will give you an accurate idea of what they thought of the mon and where it should be placed. Also, see if you can find any other players who have used the mon to get their opinions. So sometimes I'll see stuff like someone will have an absolute, like, beast of a season with a Pokemon, and then I'll reach out to 3 other players who will be like, I don't know how they did that. Or you'll reach out to that person who will be like, no, I made it look really good, but it was actually not as strong as I thought. Other times you'll reach out and you'll hear back, oh, that mon was really, really good, it should probably be up a tier, from multiple people, at which point you can then move it up. It's not usually that huge a deal overall because you're only talking about one, maybe two Pokemon every season, but it can make your tier list look a little funny and make something undraftable for basically no reason. So I don't super advise. So I would advise if something seems like it did really well, reach out to people and try to figure out whether you should move it or whether you shouldn't, based on what the feedback they give you. You should also tier your Mons based on the highest reasonable potential. You want to tier Mons based on the highest reasonable level they can form at, rather than the absolute ideal of their performance. So, Tauros K is a good example in Dynamax. The highest level potential for Tauros K is actually quite high because of Anchor Point. So, in theory, the highest absolute level of potential of Tauros K is that you get it in under Tailwind, and then you activate Anchor Point, and then you auto-sweep the opponent's team. That is its absolute highest potential. It is not really Tauros's highest reasonable potential, however, because getting that setup is really challenging. The same can be said of something like Slacking or Regigigas, where you want to make sure that you're tiering them to their highest reasonable potential, not necessarily their highest insane potential. Because if you're tiering Tauros K as if it can always be under Tailwind and then Anchor Point sweep, then you're not. It's not really going to be able to do that. I'm actually not using it. I know that UDL tiered Tauros K really high because of an Anchor Point thing at one point. This is actually not a call-out post to them, by the way. I'm just going to say that outright. They were doing a low-tier league, and Tauros was probably under-tiered for where it was at, so they bumped it. That's fine. I'm not talking about them. I am talking, though, like, in a standard VGC Series 9 draft where Tauros K is suddenly tier 1 because of that one combo. That doesn't make much sense. If a certain mode is neutered by a dex, perhaps the mode cost can be lower. I wanted to talk about that, which is where, let's say, Rain, there's no good Rain sweepers. Yeah, because in this regional dex, there aren't very many good rain setters. Maybe Pelipper doesn't need to be as high tiered to make so that, because the highest reasonable potential for a raid mode isn't really super sweeping. Now, maybe someone will super sweep or make a comp that makes rain super viable, but reasonably it'll be okay, right? So, or hail or whatever else. It doesn't mean that the Mon needs to move, as without those supports and the play from the individual, it won't be as strong. So I just kind of lost myself for a second. Sometimes you will have a player who will make that team that draws out the highest potential out of a Mon, and whenever you have that happen, it's sort of based on the other slide. You just need to make sure that you're looking at the team as a whole. I would still err on the side of tiering things higher, but you don't want to go overboard on thinking everything is a major threat, because truthfully, not everything's a major threat. There are a lot of Mons that have really fun gimmicks that will allow them to potentially spinball out of control, but the circumstances required for that are difficult to attain. Another example would be a Mon like Dunsparce. Yes, you can Serene Great Headbutt, Legendary's down. It's just not that likely to happen. You don't have to consider Dunsparce a major threat. Even though it does, but reasonably it might be able to get something off, so maybe you tier it appropriately. Just be really careful about that fallacy. One thing I want to talk about is that not all players should make tier lists. There are some top players I know who will admit that they really shouldn't be in charge of making tier lists, or they will admit to you that they're not good at making tier lists. If you're finding you're a player who shouldn't be making tier lists, that's totally cool. That's valid, it's understandable, I don't think there's any problem with it. A lot of the reason for this is that the person will typically have really strong personal feelings on a playstyle and Mons, and that makes it difficult for them to think about Mons in that abstract way, or understanding why players with different styles of play would value something so highly or poorly. So a lot of those players, they tend to play within their style that's very specific, and when they deviate from that style, they really struggle to get good results, so they tend to feel like, hey, this Mon's bad, when someone else or the majority of coaches are doing really well with it. So it's okay. That's really not a problem. I think that's totally fine if you're in that boat. Just know thyself. Overtiering versus undertiering. This is a big one. Overtiering is a very appropriate on tier lists in which the format is newer, and thus you want to play it safer for balance. If you aren't sure whether to tier something higher or lower, and it's a brand new format, tier it higher. Uh, pretty much always. It's better for trying to ensure an overall lower power level within tiers, because you don't want that top end effect where there's two mons that are just the best mons in a tier. Just bump them up. In my opinion, overtiering is usually the safest and preferred options. I will, almost anyone who's tiered with me knows that I'll tend to say something should be up a tier rather than down a tier. I think it's preferred on those mons that are on the border between mons. And it's good for keeping rolls locked to certain values as well. Keeping whatever type of roll that a Pokemon has, like let's say Follow Me, just locked to you need to spend a tier 2 to get a Follow Me that isn't Togepi. I think that's fine. Undertiering, I do think undertiering does have its uses, though. I do think undertiering is better for subsequent sequence seasons if you think a mon could function well in a lower tier and wouldn't break the balance. So if you find that this thing hasn't really been drafted, or you think it's underperforming in its current tier, and you think, hey, this could maybe bump down a tier and it wouldn't, absolutely break the balance of anything, go for it. I think that's fine. It can be used to test a mon that hasn't been selected in a higher tier to see performance. So if you have like a tier 1 that's never been drafted or a tier 2 that's never been drafted, sure, drop it and see what happens. Someone will probably pick it up. It can be used to change overall power balance if you want certain niches or modes to be less expensive overall and raise the power level of the draft. So if you want to undertier multiple things to make it so that certain niches or roles are less expensive so that more people can play with them, that will raise the power level of your draft, but if you like that, that's fine. I also think undertiering for type diversity is not a bad thing, which I've mentioned before. If you have something where it doesn't seem like it's going to break the balance, if you put it in X tier versus X tier, go ahead and do it. So, lastly, I want to talk about the ripple effect. This is probably the thing that I see get the least consideration when people move stuff. Moving a single mon can impact the rest of the draft severely, especially if that mon is something like a redirector, weather setter, or another Pokemon that helps out a really important mode. Moving something like Polito down to tier 3 from tier 2 will skyrocket the viability of rain teams, so you'll need to potentially move other things to account for this. That's kind of one of the most important things. If you move something that has a big ripple effect, you need to move other things as a result of it. The ripple effect is actually one of the reasons why democratic tiering can be a little scary. One of the big things is that sometimes I've seen it so that democratic tiering will move them on down without any consideration for the ripple effect of how it affects the things around it. Moving mons without consideration for the surrounding Pokemon, the type distribution, and other factors can cause massive issues, and it's one of my big kind of points with that. I want to also say not all mons need to be drafted. This is my opinion, and I know some people think that all mons should be able to be drafted. I'm really not of that opinion. I think that mons tend to be more undraftable in 4 to 5 tier systems versus a 6 to 7 tier system, and I think it's okay to have low value Pokemon in particular tiers to keep things balanced, especially regarding tier 1 Pokemon. Sure, this tier 1 Pokemon is pretty much outclassed by all the other tier 1s, but if you move it down to tier 2, it's too strong, so it's got to stay in tier 1. That's my opinion, because I care a lot more about the balance of a tier list than I do seeing something get play arbitrarily but breaking the balance of a season. I don't think that's worth it. I do think you can move things down to lower tiers experimentally, but there is a risk to doing so. And players with a strong bias towards wanting to use a certain mon will likely draft it even if it's not optimal. Keep in mind, this mon is likely too strong for the tier below and will still be plenty viable even if it's not the ideal choice. I really like the Pokemon Breloom. So I'll probably draft Breloom when it's not optimal. I'll draft mons that are not optimal pretty often, actually, if I like the mon. I think, a good example of a low-value tier 1 I've drafted, Latios. I think Latios is a great example. And granted, you could argue tier 2, whatever, I don't care about that. But I really like Latios, so I'll draft it even though I know it's low value because I want to use Latios for a season, and it's still good. Just because something is not super draftable in a tier doesn't mean it is a bad Pokemon. It doesn't mean that there aren't people who won't have an incentive to draft it. This idea that you should break the balance of your tier list so that everything is good to draft I just don't agree with it. I think that the balance is more important than, oh boy, I get to use a tier 1 mon in tier 2, right? I just don't agree with that. Consulting your players. Showing a finalist tier list to your player base and asking them to discuss it is a good thing for getting feedback. I think this is especially true if you have strong players in your league. It does present issues, though, because players can be very combative and very unaware of the ripple effect or believe everything should be draftable in a given tier. Some players will also be highly opinionated on a certain mon. Sometimes you run into people and they'll say, this is the best mon ever, and you have it in, like, tier 4. And they'll say, bump that to tier 1. And you're like, what? There you do run into takes like that. And I think that the ripple effect is one of the biggest things that I don't see a lot of people really consider, or that belief that this is low value, so it should go down, or go up, or whatever. I do run into that a lot too. I would advise consulting for well-developed formats basically always, but for less developed formats, I may actually advise against it. If you're talking about a really well-developed format, I do think consulting your players is always good, but if the format isn't as well-developed and you've got a pretty sizable team, I don't think it's maybe as necessary. It's up to you to decide whether you allow your players to vote to move things around your tier list. I've seen this end up very positively and very negatively. I've seen tier lists that get sort of ruined by allowing players to vote to move things around. Because the tiering committee was right and the community was wrong, and so something ends up in the wrong place and then it kind of spirals. I've also seen it to where the tiering community is wrong and the community is right, and then that move ended up being a really good thing. I honestly, though, do tend to see more negative changes happen as a result of this. Not saying you shouldn't allow players to have feedback, because of course I think that players should be able to have feedback, but I do think that you run into some really weird circumstances with democratic voting that I would prefer to not. That as someone who, when you spend so much time on a tier list, it can feel really bad when Xmon moves and then everything gets, and then a couple mons move in a couple spots and they all get drafted, and then those teams are insane because they broke the balance. I just don't ever like it with that feeling as somebody who makes a lot of tier lists. So that's a me thing. I know not everybody's going to agree with that as a take. Also, biggest thing, don't make a tier list by yourself. God, hands down, the worst tier lists I've seen have been made by one person trying to literally do everything. It just leads to major oversights. It doesn't matter how careful you are, how good of a player you are, you will have massive oversights if you do this by yourself. Consult other players when making a tier list. Make a committee, a tiering committee, or whatever, and just do that. Community as a part of draft, and getting people to volunteer for a tiering committee isn't usually that big of an ask. I've been asked multiple times to be on tiering committees, and I pretty much always say yes, because I think that it's important to help with that, and there are some people who are really good at making tier lists or really like to make tier lists. It's not, if you're running a league by yourself and you say, hey, I want to get some people to help me tier, you will likely have some people who will offer to help you tier. Making a tier list is a lot of work, but doing it with other people does lessen the work you have to do, which also makes it a lot more manageable. I want to real quick just talk about why tier list balance is important and why that is my philosophy. I will have an upcoming episode that outlines why drafting and what your draft is important, and a bad tier list is going to skew the draft aspect of playing to the forefront of the most important of the three components of draft very easily. I think the three components of draft are draft, play, and prep. I think those are the three things that make up your core components of draft, and if you have a bad tier list, you over-incentivize drafting as being the most important thing. The common situation where someone gets an unfair thing in the wrong tier is a direct advantage over other players. So let's say that we're on a locked point tier list. The intended power level is 2 tier 1s, 2 tier 2s, 2 tier 3s, and a tier 4. Okay? Now, let's say that this tier list is really not good. So instead, this person, instead of having basically 2 of each tier in a tier 4, has 3 tier 1s and 2 tier 2s and 2 tier 3s. Well, now they have a significant advantage because the intended power level was X, but they're getting a team that is this. That's insane. And then if you have a tier list that's overall balanced but has a couple mistakes, which is what you're likely going to end up with, let's say that instead you have a tier 3 that's too low, so the person effectively gets an extra tier 2, and that's it. That's not a huge deal. But strong drafts winning season through great planning are well and good. I think that if you make a great draft and that helps you win a season because you planned it well and because the team is just really, really tightly made, I think that's awesome. That's like a lot of the reason I love draft. But if you have a draft that is really strong, that won because the tier list wasn't made well and because you just abused the power level, I don't think that's ideal. I don't think that's as fair in terms of balance, and that's why I care so much about this topic. Final thoughts. Making a good tier list is a difficult process that's built around trial and error. You need to make a lot of considerations when making a tier list, and you should keep an open mind while you're constructing a tier list. Take feedback from coaches and other people and really try to take what they say to heart and try to consider that viewpoint. Tier lists are really multifaceted, and making one requires a very holistic and careful viewpoint. And no tier list will be perfect, but I do think it is more than worthwhile to spend your time trying to make a great tier list to ensure that you make it as balanced and as fun a season as possible. Let me know what you thought of this video and if you enjoyed it. I'd love to hear some feedback in the comments. I know that I had like one section of this where I was totally incomprehensible, my bad, but the rest of it should be relatively understandable. So I'll be seeing you all next time with episode 2 whenever I decide to sit down and record it. Bye!